Good morning.
Good morning. Well, I'm here again to update you on what's happening in the legislature. And while discussions on water-related policy and legislation are most definitely occurring, I think it's safe to say that right now they are not the central focus of the building right now. Bills related to groundwater management, regional water planning, and of course the various water bond bills are moving through the legislative process without a lot of fanfare or controversy. And my inclination, which I think is shared by staff in the building and those who work around the Capitol, is that the real negotiations and discussions on major water issues have yet to really begin in earnest. May 2nd and May 9th mark two procedural deadlines that will further assist in narrowing the focus of the legislature on water issues and other issues as well. By these dates, bills need to make it successfully out of their house of origin. Bills that fail to complete that task go to the great bill graveyard in the sky, or they become part of some sort of gut and amend strategy later in the session, perhaps. But what it means for us is that we begin to get a better idea of which water bills are being taken seriously by the legislature. So the legislature was in spring recess last week, which slowed down activity a little bit. Next week, however, there are 4 bond bills scheduled for hearing in the Water Parks and Wildlife Committee. So the legislature will hopefully further focus its bond bills and priorities at that time. Speaking of the water bond bills, there are still about 9 or 10 water bond bills, depending on the way that you count them. They are still in varying stages of development and with varying ranges of detail. And we have provided, once again, thanks to my fellow Elizabeth, a spreadsheet of the updated water bond bills. So hopefully you have a copy of that in front of you. Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. There's also some on the back table for those in the audience who are interested, and it'll be posted on our website as well. So some of the water bond bills have progressed through the process since we last met in March. AB 1331, Assemblymember Rendon's bond bill, is headed to the Senate Committee on Environmental Quality, having already successfully made it through the Water Parks and Wildlife Committee and the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee. However, that version of his bill includes some amendments with which the author is not pleased, though he was implored to accept. So he has introduced a related bond bill, which is remarkably similar to his pre-amended version, which is AB 2554. So we'll be watching both versions of that bill to see what happens next. AB 2554 is scheduled for hearing in the Assembly next week. Senator Galgiani's bond, 1370, was heard for information only, which means no vote was taken in the Senate Policy Committee earlier this month. And Assemblymember Bigelow, who is also the vice chair of the Water Parks and Wildlife Committee, dropped his bond bill. And then Senator Canella's bond failed to make it out of the Senate Policy Committee this week. So there has been some change and some narrowing. On the back of your spreadsheet, you will find a storage-focused spreadsheet, which was also prepared by our fellow Elizabeth Marcellet. Since the focus of today's council meeting is storage, I wanted you to have at your fingertips what's being discussed at the state level in terms of funding and eligibility.
Yeah.
So as you can see, there are really more similarities than there are differences. Nearly all the bonds have funding for surface storage and for groundwater. Many have $3 billion for storage, same as the 2009 water bond bill, but some go beyond that and one drops to $1 billion. Of course, keep in mind that that funding is only for the public benefits aspect of water storage, meaning that water user beneficiaries would need to come forward with matching funds before projects could move forward. We are quickly approaching a peak time for budget discussions in the legislature. May 15th is the May revision, also known as May revise, and this is when the governor presents a revised version of his budget, which is consistent with updated revenue projections and any other changes that may have come up over the preceding months since the introduction of his January 10 version. based on news reports and just buzz around the building, it certainly looks as though the legislature and the administration will be facing a number of complicated issues during their budget negotiations in May and in June. The governor announced last week he's convening a special session to try to work out a revised proposal for a rainy day fund for the state. In general, a rainy day fund forces savings during good times to be used in bad times. This may sound familiar because California actually already has a rainy day fund. This was approved by voters in 2004. It was called Prop 58. And it automatically directs 3% of annual revenues into a budget stabilization account. However, in Governor Brown's announcement of the special session, he highlighted the need for changes to that fund. He cites the lack of restrictions on the withdrawal of those funds and the fact that it requires deposits even in years of deficit. So he wants to tie a new rainy day fund to the most volatile state income source, which would be capital gains. His sense of urgency is driven by a competing reform measure on the November ballot, which he seeks to replace. The November ballot measure would cap the amount of spending to the amount previously spent in the prior year, adjusted for inflation, and then automatically send the surplus to the rainy day fund. Of course, a 2/3 vote is going to be required in the legislature for any changes, and they'll be subject to the June 26th Secretary of State deadline. So we'll see what happens there. June 15th is the budget deadline. As always, additional major issues on the negotiating table could include CalSTRS retirement deficit funding, allocation of cap and trade revenues, universal preschool, and then groundwater reform, and not to mention potential water bond negotiations. So just wanted to set the stage for the context of what's happening in the legislature. While we focus on the water and Delta aspects, there's much, much more happening. And the good news for the governor and the legislature is that the financial reports from the Department of Finance and the Comptroller's Office continue to look good. According to the Department of Finance's April 2014 report, the preliminary general fund cash for March was $500 million above the 2014-15 governor's budget projections of $6 billion. And year-to-date revenues are running about $1.5 billion ahead of forecasts. A quick note on federal legislation. Senator Feinstein introduced a revised version of her drought bill on April 1st. It's the Emergency Drought Relief Act of 2014. This version is similar to her previous version, except for it has $300 million less in spending, which presumably was done to appeal to her Republican colleagues with whom she's actively trying to negotiate. There's not been much progress on the other 3 drought bills that I reported on at the last council meeting. However, there are a number of water storage bills in the House, including a couple by Congressman Costa, which would federally authorize the San Luis Reservoir expansion, Shasta expansion, and Upper San Joaquin storage studies. And then there is also a Miller-Costa bill to expedite additional expansion for the Los Vaqueros Reservoir in Contra Costa County. So that concludes my report, unless you have any questions.
Questions of Jessica? No. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Very good report. Next item, file item 6B, Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee update. Taryn Ravizini. Welcome, Taryn.